Are you tired of your podcast feeling like just another thing on your to-do list? We can fix it. I'm Stacey Harris, and at Uncommonly More, we turn podcasts into sustainable sales assets that actually work for your business even long after your release date has passed. Whether you're launching a new show or leveling up an existing one, my podcast strategy intensive gives you a clear plan to make your podcast a tool that drives sales results. You'll walk away with a 12-week content plan, actionable steps, and the confidence to make it happen. Plus, you'll have 30 days of email access to me to get any questions answered that come up. Visit uncommonlymore.com/intensive to book your intensive today, and let's build a podcast that works as hard as you do. It's that time of year again as we wrap up this year and review what's been and start looking ahead to next year and set goals for what will be. I want you to check in with your podcast goals because the new year is coming and doubling your downloads isn't the goal you need because it will not solve your sales problem. More listeners to a show that isn't already generating sales will not start generating sales. So what I want to do today is talk through setting some goals that will help align you with better sales success from your podcast in the new year. Let's get into it. Welcome to the More Profitable Podcast with Stacey Harris. I'm Stacey, and this is the spot to learn more about the strategies, tactics, and tools you need to build your more profitable podcast. My team and I work every day with podcasters like you to shift shows from frustrating time sucks to productive members of your sales team, because your show should be built to generate and convert leads. So let's get into it. This is a really important conversation that I want us to have because so often when I sit down with podcasters and we're talking about their goals, because one of the questions I ask when you book a consultation with me, either whether you're looking at the intensive or you're looking at production work with us, is like, what are the goals for your podcast for the next 6 months or the next 12 months or whatever the question is? I honestly can't remember the timeline. But I ask this because I want to know what your show needs to be doing for you. And most of the time, the person enters something around growth of their listenership. So like doubling their podcast downloads, or maybe it's it'll just say increase downloads or get more viewers or get more listeners, whatever it may be. But it's always tied to getting more consumers. And so when we get on the call, oftentimes, and if you've had a call with me, you've heard me say this, I'll go, how much are you seeing as far as sales from your podcast right now? How frequently are people bringing up your podcast in a sales call conversation? How often are people referencing your podcast when you ask them how they found you? If the answer to that's none, more listeners is not going to solve the problem you have with your show. Because if the frustration with your show is that you're not seeing it lead to sales, more listeners won't change that. I before I shifted our focus completely into podcasting, I did a lot of social media stuff. And if you've been around for a really long time, you know this. But one of the things I talked a lot about with social media was the same premise. More followers will not get you more sales from social media if your social media efforts are not currently getting you sales. Your sales page is not going to convert if you just drive more traffic to it. Going and dumping hundreds or thousands or tens of thousands of dollars into Facebook ads or Instagram ads or Google ads are not going to get you conversions if your sales page doesn't already convert visitors. Does this mean that it will never work to grow the visibility of something unless every single person is currently converting on it? No, absolutely. There's always going to be a margin, right? In most cases, we're looking for like 1 to 3% conversions. However, if you're currently getting 0% of however many people are listening converting, adding more people is still going to get you 0. This is the one multiplication fact I remember. Anything times 0 is 0. It's cold. It's not what we want to hear, but it's the reality. So when year after year, you're setting the same goal of growing your podcast listenership, you're going to keep creating the same frustration come your end of the year review. This is why we're having this conversation today, because We're gonna break this cycle, you and I, today. What I want us to focus on is what are some of the steps that you can be taking with your show? What are the things you need to be looking for and making sure you're getting in there to actually meet a meaningful goal, which is more sales from your podcast, to be generating and converting leads with your podcast, because it is already costing you too much time and mental capacity to not be converting for you. All right. So that's what we're going to dig into today. Before we do that, I want to remind you we've got brand new episodes up now on the podcast newsroom just last week. If you're listening to this when it goes live, I answered a question all around knowing when it's time to refresh your podcast strategy. This is a great question. It actually ties really well into what we're talking about today. So head on over to the podcast newsroom.com and get your access to the feed if you have not yet. And if you have, make sure you head to your feed and listen to that one. Because again, it ties really well into this conversation we're having today. And it's a good time of year for that conversation. So head on over to the podcastnewsroom.com today. As we're digging into this today, I want to remind you that I've worked with a lot of podcasters, and numbers do not mean sales. Downloads do not mean dollars. You're not going to see a direct connection to having a lot of listeners, to having a lot of sales. It's frustrating. I would like it to be untrue, but it is. Here's the upside to that, though. Here's the silver lining to this. You don't need nearly as many listeners as you think you need to see results from your show. I don't have a huge show. I don't have hundreds of thousands of downloads every episode. I just don't. I don't need that many downloads. I don't need that many listeners. We talked a little bit about this in an episode we did a while back. I will link to it in the show notes, where we talked about how many downloads should your podcast be getting. And that number alone is significantly lower than you think it is. The average show, in fact, I'm going to pull up some data right now. I've got Buzzsprout in front of me and their global stats page. I will link this in the show notes. I love this as a check-in point for how many downloads the average show is getting. So what Buzzsprout does is it shares the stats across all of the shows it hosts. And let me just burst some bubbles here. To be doing better than half of the shows in the world, so you are in the top 50, you're getting 28 downloads in your first 7 days. To be in the top 25%, you're getting 111 downloads in your first 7 days. So the first week your show is live, 111 people download it. That means you are one of the top 25% of podcasters. Now let's start getting into the numbers of where most of our clients sit. First 7 days, top 10%, 467 downloads. That puts you in the top 10 shows. We want to move to top 5, 1,099. So just a tick under 1,100 downloads in the first week, not the first day. In the first week, this is where most of our shows sit, is in this top 5% spot. And a couple of our shows sit in this top 1% spot, which means in the first week, again, week, 7 days, not 1 day, 7 days, they're getting just over 4,700 with 4,730 downloads in that first week. That's what the top 1% is going. I want you to note that even that top 1% number is a 4-figure number, not a 5-figure number. So many people that I talk to think that most shows are getting what that top 1% number is, that 4,700, in the first day it goes live, much less the first week. We are overinflating what podcast download numbers are for other shows in order to minimize our results. Your results are probably a lot better than you think they are. So when we think about these numbers and we think about like, okay, let's go with that top 10%, right? 467 downloads in the first week of an episode. Let's say you're already getting that. If you're already there and you're not seeing leads come in from your show, something else has to change. And frankly, it's probably not a production problem. What it is a strategy problem. What it is a problem in tying your content to your offers. You are building entertainment and not a sales tool. And so, what I want you to be thinking about is how can I set goals to help me make sure I'm building a sales tool? And some of that's going to be setting goals around your process. If right now you're struggling to think about your content plan, if you're struggling to come up with ideas, going to Google, heading into ChatGPT, that's not going to be your answer. Because both of those things are working off bad data. They're working off the general internet as a whole. They're not getting specific to who you are, who your clients are, what your offer is, and how you sell them that offer. That's branding, that's ideal client, that's offer development, that's messaging. Those problems are not going to be solved with a Google search. Does this mean that you need to go out and spend tens of thousands of dollars getting support in each of these areas? Probably not. You probably know more than you think you do. But these are the problems that I sit down with clients on in our podcast strategy intensives all the time because they know these pieces. They just don't know how to connect it with their podcast. They're just not consistently pulling in that messaging, pulling in that direction because they're not thinking about their show that way. They're thinking about getting their show done. And so instead of setting goals this year around growing your listenership, I want you to set goals around getting strategic support, getting production support, the kinds of calls to action you're having, building out your pre-launch content for that offer that you sell twice a year, every year. If you've got a mastermind that opens in the spring and the fall every single year, there is absolutely no reason that we're not already building assets that you can be releasing, that you could be re-releasing, that you could be iterating. If you've not done that yet, that's the goal for this new year. That's the focus for what's ahead. Not adding X number of listeners before that next launch. It's building assets going to sell the listeners you've already got. That's the goal I want you to have. I want you to be looking to have more people show up on sales calls quoting your podcast. I want you to be setting goals around having more people mark the box, listen to your podcast when you ask them how they found you. I do not have a massive listenership. I've shared this. I have a relatively small show. My show absolutely sits in that top 10% window, which is great, but it's not huge. I'm not doing massive numbers. I don't need to. We bring in 10 to 15 clients a year across all of our offers. Our higher end offer, our production, we bring in 4 to 6 clients a year. And honestly, generally closer to 4 than 6. That's it. That's all we have room for. And that's often dependent on turnover. And so if I'm selling successfully to hundreds of thousands of listeners, I'm blowing out my team's capacity and I'm burning myself out. I don't need those numbers to hit my revenue goals. And oftentimes, what I see is people who own businesses like I do, because we work with service providers, high end consultants, we're working with people who are selling generally somewhere in their business a high end offer. And if they're already sitting in this top 10 or often top 5% of their show and they're unable to see results, More listeners is not the problem. They already have enough listeners that if they were converting at that 1 to 3%, they'd have plenty of business. They'd have plenty of leads, but they're not. And oftentimes, that's because they're not selling in their show. But let's shift this. Let's look at this from another angle because maybe you are selling with your show. You are strategically building content, you have calls to action. Then it comes down to, do you have the right people listening? Have you built a show that attracts your ideal clients? Or have you built a show that attracts your peers, which is one I see a ton in the marketing space? Us marketers love hanging out with other marketers. And so we often build content and shows that mostly speaks to other marketers, which is great. I have some clients who are marketers. I have hired other people who do marketing things that I don't do because I don't do everything all the time, and I'm always looking to improve my skills, not just for me and not just for my business, but because it helps my clients. I'm always looking to get better. I'm always investing in continuing education because I know it's how I make sure that we all benefit. And when we as marketers or coaches or wellness folks create shows that speak to other marketers or coaches or wellness folks, we just end up in an echo chamber. And no one's buying anything because we're just all sitting around listening to stuff that allows us to nod along in the car or out loud disagree on our walk. I've been there. Makes me look a little cuckoo, but I like it. It's okay. I'm self-aware. That's important. So I want you to be looking at, who are you creating this show for? If you're in this top 10%, this top 5%, and you're happy with the downloads you're seeing, you've got listeners coming over and over, you've got calls to action in your show, I want you to start telling me who's engaging with you about your podcast in your social media, replying to your emails. Is it ideal clients or is it peers? Because if it's peers, and we went through this with a intensive client last year. If it's your peers, that's the problem. That target demo, the who we're creating content for, who we're selling to, that's your missing piece. And oftentimes, the only real evolution that has to happen in your content is in the presentation and the marketing of your show. Because oftentimes, once I get into it, it'll work for colleagues or ideal clients, especially depending on who your ideal client is. But if we're not positioning the show and or sharing the show in places where it's easy for those ideal clients to recognize that this thing is for them, they're not going to know we exist. And so oftentimes it's the packaging that has to be changed, not the content. With that said, also be looking at your content. Are you talking in jargon? Are you talking about how you do what you do? Or are you talking about how your ideal client can prepare for the work you do? This is such an important differentiator in how-to content. And honestly, I probably need to do a whole episode on this. If that's valuable for you, please reach out. Tell me in the DMs. Let me know. Because it's one of those episodes, and I say this as somebody who does this for a living. It's one of those episodes I've thought about doing for a long time, and I've just never done. And so if really breaking down how-to content sounds good, drop me a DM on Instagram. Send me a message over on Threads. By the way, I have really enjoyed my Threads time. I'm loving it over there. It reminds me of old Twitter. Anyways, we've got, if that how-to content would be interesting, let me know. But back to our point, one of the red flags to look for that we're building a show for colleagues and not clients, not prospective clients, is that how-to content, because we're trying to prove how much we know. And when you stay in this energy of proving how much you know, it's actually really hard to convert. which feels super counterintuitive. But your prospective clients, your potential leads, don't care how much you know. They care what outcome you can help them get. And so it needs to be less about telling them how much you know, showing them how much you know about your job, and instead showing them that you know how to get them to the result they want by starting to walk them up to where they need to be to take advantage of the work that you do. It could be something as simple as, if you're sitting and listening to this episode, and when we were talking about things like messaging and branding and ideal client breakdowns and offer breakdowns, and you were like, "Oh, I really need to revamp my offers next year. That's going to be a really important part of this." Or you're hesitating to sell because your offers might evolve, they're a work in progress, whatever. You need to go have an offer conversation. And this conversation is my way of helping you recognize that, right? If you flagged on the brand side of things, then that might be a problem that you need to solve alongside what's happening with your podcast. If you are absolutely feeling called out on the idea that you might have been creating a show for your peers and not your potential clients, then you know the work that you need to do. And that's going to mean when you and I sit down for a podcast strategy intensive or for your kickoff call for production work with us, you're going to be ready to roll because you'll have already done this work. So this episode is a decent example. I was going to say great, but it's a decent example of how-to content that's not about how I do my job. This is client education that is not, here's how to produce your own show. Here's how to build your own strategy. Because entirely likely that you already know how to do that. And yet, that's not solved the problem. It's often not about knowing how to do the thing. It's about being supported while you do the thing. It's about getting outside perspective. That's the biggest value in working with clients the way I do in our podcast strategy intensives, maybe most specifically, is its perspective. For our ongoing production clients, the clients who we've been working with for years, I know their business. I know their offers. I know their clients. I know their content. I know all of it at this point because we've worked together deeply for multiple years. And so oftentimes we're running things through the filter of like, hey, I've got this idea. I just need you to tell me if I'm missing something. If I'm not seeing something because I'm inside the jar and can't read the label. And so teaching them how to do what you do is likely not what they need because they may already understand the logistical output that needs to happen to achieve the result. They need perspective. They need guidance. They need support. They need accountability. They need those pieces handled. They need to know that you understand. They need to know that you are going to partner with them on creating an outcome. They need to know that there is an outcome that is different, that is possible. And that's what your content needs to be speaking to. And if you're talking to your peers, it's very likely not. As you sit down and you set your goals for the new year, I really encourage you to be looking at building sales goals, building checkpoints for, I'm going to have these kind of episodes created. If you've never created an audio sales page, that's on your goal for Q1 of the new year. Is build an audio sales page for your most evergreen offer or for the offer you launch every Q1. Because that's going to help you start building assets you can repurpose. You can, do things like add it to email sales funnels or send it over to folks when they ask a question on threads or drop into your DMs. That's what I want you to be setting goals around: creating assets. Creating things that give you space away from your podcast. Maybe this is the year you need to build a repeatable series. Then that's a great goal for the new year, because this year I'm going to create this, because that means in the next year, I'm going to be able to take XYZ off. This is why we run the same series every August. It's helpful for you. It's helpful for listeners who haven't heard it before. And it buys me time in July, which I either use to take time off or I use to start working ahead on my end of the year content, because I try to get really ahead before we get into our busy Q4. Whatever it is, those are the kind of goals I want you to be setting. Sales goals, production goals, process goals, goals that buy you some time and space back, which might include getting support. And if that does include getting support, we don't have to wait till next year. We can start talking about that now. We've got podcast strategy intensive spots open for the new year. We've got production spots open for the new year, but the time to have those conversations and get them booked is now. So head on over to uncommonlymore.com, check out production, check out the intensives, and I would love to sit down and talk about what support can look like for you. All right? I will see you right back here next week. Thanks so much for listening to the show. Remember that content consumption does not make changes. So commit to doing something from today's episode. Maybe it's taking action on what we talked about. Maybe it's reaching out to me and learning more about podcast strategy intensives or what podcast production looks like with our team. All of that is over at uncommonlymore.com. And if you haven't yet signed up for the podcast newsroom, I want to remind you that is a great next step. If you're not really sure what comes next, hang out over there. Get those exclusive private episodes. That's over at podcastnewsroom.com. And the last favor I will ask, because social proof is endlessly important for sure, is to leave a rating or review for the show. If you go to ratethispodcast.com/more, that's the easiest way to do it. But I would love to hear what you thought of the show, what you think of the show, and if the show has been helpful for you. I can't wait to chat with you. So this is just the start of the conversation. Reach out so we can keep it going. Talk soon.